Welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're venturing deep into the shadowed hills and backwoods of the Appalachian Mountains, where old legends, isolated cabins, and hidden trails hold secrets that shouldn't be found. Each one proving that sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters, they're human. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you? Now, let's step into the darkness together. I always thought I'd settle into the quiet after the divorce, like slipping into a softer pair of shoes once the blisters healed. But that never really happened. I'd been teaching 4th grade in Pikeville long enough to know the rhythm of the seasons, and last fall should have felt comforting in its routine of foggy mornings, spelling quizzes, and cafeteria apples that tasted faintly like the cardboard they came in. Instead, I came home each afternoon to this little rental house pressed up against a half-harvested cornfield, the stalks standing like ribs behind the backyard. My principal had joked that I was lucky to have all that space to myself, but the space didn't feel lucky at all. It felt like a reminder that I wasn't wanted anymore, that my ex had moved on while I was still trying to figure out how to sleep alone. The first night I noticed something out there. I'd been grading reading logs and sipping reheated Maxwell House when I saw a figure step from one corn row to the next, slow and deliberate, like someone testing the ground. I thought it was just a neighbor's kid cutting through, odd but harmless, and the innocent thing was that he was holding a small yellow toy bucket, swinging it lightly, like he was collecting something invisible from the fog. That detail stuck with me when I went to bed, though I told myself it didn't matter. What mattered was sticking to my new routines, checking the locks twice, keeping the living room lamp on low, and trying not to imagine my ex-husband settling into a bigger house with warmer lights. The next evening, my motion sensor floodlight blinked on while I was microwaving leftover chili, and it startled me badly enough that I spilled some on my wrist. The light almost never went off, unless a raccoon wandered close, and usually I'd hear the trash can lid clatter. But when I stepped onto the back stoop, the yard was undisturbed. The corn swayed only with the wind, and I found myself scanning for the yellow bucket without knowing why. I rationalized it as a glitch. Maybe moisture got into the sensor, and I went back to my chili with the metallic smell of the fog still clinging to my clothes. Over the next couple of days, little things began to feel misplaced, though I kept telling myself the stress of the divorce was making me scatterbrained. One Thursday evening, I came home to find the back door unlocked, even though I was absolutely sure I had locked it that morning. Nothing was stolen, but a faint muddy smear sat at knee-height on the glass, like someone had pressed a dirty sleeve there. I called my sister, Erin, and asked if she'd ever come by without telling me, and she laughed it off, saying, "Pikeville dirt gets everywhere, Annie, don't overthink it." When I cleaned the glass later, the mud had a sour, earthy smell that lingered on my fingers even after washing, something denser than just soil. I told myself it was from the field, but the thought dug in with an ache, like pressing on a bruise left over from a fight I never won. The first real piece of proof appeared the following night. I'd just finished grading spelling tests when the motion light clicked on again, sharp enough to throw a hard white stripe across my living room wall. My heart sped up, and for a moment I just sat there, listening to the refrigerator hum, the room growing colder as if the fog itself had seeped under the door. I forced myself outside with my phone flashlight raised like a weapon, and that's when I saw the muddy handprint. This time it was centered on the back door window, unmistakable, wet and fresh with fingers spread wide, as if whoever pressed it wanted to feel the warmth on the other side. I took a photo and sent it to Erin immediately, but when she came over 20 minutes later, the print had faded to nothing but a faint haze. "You probably smudged it cleaning the other night," she said gently. And though she had clearly seen how shaken I was, she dismissed it with that tight smile I'd come to hate from everyone since the divorce. The invalidation felt worse than fear, because it carried the same sting of being left behind, of being told I was imagining the things that hurt. After she left, the house felt colder. I kept hearing tiny crackles from the back window, little settling noises that made me picture fingertips tapping the glass. Around midnight, trying to prove to myself I was fine, I replayed the 10-second video clip I'd taken of the door. At first it looked normal, but when the camera tilt steadied, the handprint seemed to grow darker for a moment, as if something behind the glass leaned forward. I convinced myself that was impossible. It had to be compression artifacts or my shaky hand, but the uneasy feeling stayed lodged in my throat. I went to bed with that metallic taste at the back of my tongue. The same taste I'd swallowed during the divorce hearings, as if fear and heartbreak came from the same place in the body. I didn't sleep well for the next 3 nights. Every time I drifted off, a soft scrape of something brushing the siding would snap me awake, and I'd lie perfectly still, counting my breaths until the noise faded. On Sunday, just before dawn, I looked out the kitchen window and saw someone standing between the corn rows. Not moving. Just a shape with shoulders slightly hunched, facing the house. I whispered, "Please go," under my breath, even though no one could hear me. When I dared to look again, the figure slid from one row to the next, disappearing like a shadow passing through curtains. That movement, a quiet, gliding sideways step, made my skin tighten along my arms. I couldn't see the yellow bucket anymore, but I remembered it so vividly, it felt like a warning I'd missed. Later that day, I told my neighbor, Mr. Dalton, hoping he'd dismiss my fears with practical country wisdom. He followed me out back, squinting at the corn, and pointed out there were no footprints anywhere, not even raccoon tracks. "Fog tricks the eyes," he said, "and you've been under a lot, teaching and all that. Life changes." The way he said, "life changes," made my cheeks burn, because it was the same tone people used when they meant, "Your husband left and we all know it." When we turned back toward the house, he slowed, brow furrowing as he stared at the door. The handprint had returned, darker than before, the mud thicker, the fingers longer. He opened his mouth like he might say something, but then he blinked, wiped at the glass with his sleeve, and the mark vanished instantly. "Just condensation," he muttered before walking away faster than he needed to. The isolation I felt in that moment grew sharp enough to make my chest tighten. That evening held the moment I still can't forget. I was washing dishes with the window cracked open when I heard a faint breathing sound, subtle and rhythmic like someone trying not to be noticed. I froze, soap dripping from my hands, and leaned closer to the window screen. The breath continued, slow, patient, but I couldn't see anyone in the yard. The corn rustled with no wind, a single row shifting as though someone brushed their hand across the stalks. When I stepped outside, the cold mist wrapped around me instantly, thick enough to bead on my eyelashes. My motion light stayed off this time, which unsettled me even more. Then, right as I stepped toward the corn, the light flickered on behind me. I spun around, expecting to see someone on the stoop, but instead the handprint reappeared, pressed hard against the glass from the inside. My inside. I dropped the dish towel and ran back in so fast I nearly tripped, slamming the door and backing away as the print slowly faded, leaving only a faint outline of its size burned into my brain. By then I had started keeping notes, scribbling down each moment of strangeness in a little Mead notebook I used for lesson planning. Over the next few days, the handwriting began to warp on certain pages, letters stretching or cramping as if my hand had dragged strangely. One sentence, "I saw him between the rows again," looked like it had been rewritten by someone else, the loops too wide and the tail ends dipping lower than I ever wrote. I showed it to my colleague, Marianne, during our lunch break, and she frowned, saying it looked normal. "You're exhausted," she told me. "You're going to scare yourself into a panic attack if you don't get some rest." When I looked at the page later, the words had distorted even more, curling slightly as if the ink hadn't fully dried. The final push came on a Thursday night when I found myself sitting awake at 2 a.m. because I couldn't shake the feeling something had changed in the yard. I stepped onto the back stoop with a flashlight and scanned the corn, and that's when I saw the figure standing just at the edge of the rows. Tall now, too tall to be a child. Its eye, shoulders angled as if it had grown tired of hiding. I couldn't see its face. I only sensed it watching me with the same steady patience someone might use to wait out an animal. The flashlight beam flickered, and a freezing patch of air wrapped around my left wrist, squeezing hard enough to make me gasp. When I stumbled back inside, a dark bruise shaped like a thumbprint had already formed there. I still have it, faint but permanent, an imprint I can't explain. I left Pikeville the next afternoon, packed my car in less than an hour, grabbed only the essentials, and drove until the cornfields gave way to wooded hills and then city lights. I told the school I needed time away, and they didn't ask many questions. Maybe they saw the tremor in my hands, or the way I flinched at every reflection. I found an apartment in Lexington with no fields nearby, just traffic noise and street lamps I can trust. But even now, sometimes around 4 in the morning, I wake with that metallic taste in my mouth and the vague sense of someone standing just outside my window. The notebook I brought with me still holds those warped sentences, and every few days that one line grows a little darker, as though rewritten in a heavier hand. I've learned to live with the mark on my wrist, and I've learned to ignore the quiet shifts in the dark. But if you ever move somewhere with corn behind the house, and you see a motion light flicker when nothing should be there, don't step outside. Don't look for who might be slipping between the rows. Just close the curtains and never, ever acknowledge the first handprint. Before we jump into the next story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. We really need your love and support. I'd been living mostly out of my own car by last November, not literally sleeping in it, but close enough with how many back-to-back shifts I pulled as a paramedic in Bluefield, taking that same narrow mountain road home each night like it was the only part of my life that stayed consistent. The trees were stripped bare, their branches bowing over the asphalt like ribs, and the cold rain that never seemed to stop left a metallic smell in the air that clung to my scrubs no matter how often I washed them. The night it started, I rounded the first bend and saw a deer standing in the wash of my headlights, its head tilted strangely as if listening for something. It didn't run or flinch, just lifted its antlers slightly, letting rain drip from them in a slow, steady rhythm that reminded me too much of the ticking wall clock in our ambulance bay. I didn't think much of it then, because burnout had been eating me alive for months, and seeing wildlife on the road was normal. But something about how still it stood tugged at a part of me I'd been ignoring. By the time I reached the second bend and saw that same deer in the same position again, I told myself it had to be another one, even though the pattern of raindrops on its coat looked identical, and the left side of its chest had a darker patch, like it had brushed against something wet. I'd been scared lately of how easily my mind drifted during calls, how often I caught myself forgetting basic steps, and I blamed the creeping dread on that, on fatigue and too many midnight transports. I flipped on the radio to drown out the unease, but right as the static cleared, the deer blinked twice, slow, deliberate, almost mechanical, and my radio cut out mid-sentence. For a second, I tasted something metallic on the back of my tongue, the same taste I got the night I froze during a cardiac arrest and watched another medic take over for me. The memory hit hard enough that my hands shook on the wheel. I pulled over at a scenic overlook turnout that barely fit one car and snapped a picture with my phone because I needed proof that I wasn't losing it. The headlights showed the deer still standing there, rain sliding down its antlers like measured drops, and I tried to steady my breathing. When I checked the photo, though, the deer wasn't in it. Not even a blur or shadow, just empty, wet pavement. I showed the image later to my partner, Lucas, during shift change before we clocked in, and he laughed, saying I must have forgotten to lift the phone in time, or maybe my camera glitched in the rain. He said it so casually that I almost accepted it, but something about the easy dismissal stung. It reminded me how often people had been telling me lately that I looked tired or distracted, like they were trying not to call me unstable. The next night it was worse. I saw the deer not just once, but at 3 separate bends, always before my headlights reached it, almost like it was waiting for me. Its antlers dripped their steady rhythm, and the sound hit my windshield faintly, like tiny wet taps counting down seconds. When I slowed near the 3rd bend, the deer lifted its head, and the air inside my car went colder. The kind of cold that sinks into your bones. I whispered out loud that I was just overtired, that it was only stress, but then the deer stepped forward without making a sound, and the tapping of water from its antlers sped into a quicker pattern that almost matched my heartbeat. I hit the gas so hard my tires skidded on the wet asphalt, and for a moment the shape of the deer stretched oddly in my rearview mirror, like the edges of its body couldn't quite stay together. Halfway home, I stopped beneath one of the few street lamps on the mountain road, shaking. And that's when I noticed a small bruise forming on my left collarbone, shaped like 2 faint parallel lines. I pressed it and felt a deep cold radiate under my skin. I hadn't bumped into anything all day, but I convinced myself maybe the stretcher clipped me, or maybe I hadn't noticed a patient grabbing at me during a transfer. Anything felt easier than admitting something else had touched me or marked me. I tried to take a picture of the bruise for proof, but when I checked the gallery later, the image was too dark. The skin blurred like my phone had filmed through fog. Every attempt after that came out the same. A few nights later, after a long shift filled with nothing but false alarms, dehydration headaches, and the creeping sense that everyone could see how frayed I'd become, I drove home in a downpour so heavy my wipers could barely keep up. I told myself I wouldn't look for the deer, but every curve made my shoulders tense. Near the last sharp bend before the straight stretch toward my neighborhood, I saw 2 faint reflections that looked like eyes floating above the ground. They blinked twice, just like before, and the radio died again, even though I'd replaced its batteries that morning. My chest seized with a rush of fear so fast I couldn't breathe, and when the full body of the deer came into view, it was standing closer to the road than any animal should have dared with a car approaching. Water trailed from its antlers faster this time, like a clock ticking out of rhythm, counting down something I couldn't understand. I slowed almost to a stop without meaning to, the cold inside the cab tightening around me, and the deer's head tilted the same way it had the first night, like it was listening. Its eyes didn't shine like normal animal eyes reflecting headlights. They looked deep, dull, like they absorbed the light instead of bouncing it back. I whispered, "Please don't," and the deer took a step toward my car, the tapping of water from its antlers landing on the pavement in measured beats that echoed inside my skull. Then another step, and another, and something in its movement felt wrong, like the body wasn't sure how legs were supposed to bend. I floored. The gas again, nearly fishtailing, and didn't look back. I barely slept after that, and the bruise on my collarbone never fully faded. It stayed cool to the touch, even on warm mornings, as if something lingered under the skin. The photo I took on that turnout still sits in my phone, just black pavement and rain, but the file itself feels corrupted somehow. Every time I open it, my phone brightness dims automatically, and the audio icon on the corner flickers, although the image shouldn't have any sound attached at all. I've tried telling myself it was all fatigue or stress, or some form of creeping burnout hallucination. But last week, on a morning when I'd slept 8 full hours and felt clear-headed for the first time in months, I turned into my driveway and saw something standing at the far end near the shed. A deer. Still. Waiting. Its antlers dripping in that slow, familiar rhythm that doesn't match the rain at all. If you ever see an animal blink twice at the exact moment something else goes silent, don't wait for it to step closer. Just leave. Don't look back. I had spent the last year in my tiny apartment in Bellingham, Washington, mostly avoiding people and screens after a rough stint at the tech firm. Social anxiety wasn't new to me, but after my team disbanded and my manager stopped returning calls, I realized just how much I had tied my self-worth to being useful, being seen. Without it, I felt exposed in a way that made me shrink inside myself. Thanksgiving was always quiet for me, but last year the freezing rain drove everyone else indoors, while I huddled near the dining room window, trying to make the small apartment feel cozy. That afternoon, while wiping condensation off the glass, I caught the first glimpse of him. A man in the reflection, standing just behind my chair, watching me arrange the table. I spun around, empty room. My heart skipped, throat tight, and yet the smile in the reflection remained for a heartbeat longer, as if he was aware I'd seen him. The condensation formed into a vague face again, just enough to make my skin crawl. I chalked it up to foggy glass and imagination, but the unease clung like damp clothing. I tried to ignore it, telling myself 3 years of tradition hadn't harmed anyone, and maybe the reflection was just me, a distorted figure I hadn't noticed before. I set the plates with trembling hands, my fork slipping once onto the counter. The metallic taste of panic filled my mouth as I glanced at the window again. The figure was closer, sharper, and the smile lingered. I told my roommate Mark about it later over the phone, explaining the condensation, the reflection, the impossible grin. He laughed nervously, claiming it was the weather, maybe a trick of the glass, and when I asked him to check, he said he hadn't seen anything. That denial gnawed at me, making me question my own eyes. I had always felt like the walls of the world were pressing closer when I wasn't noticed. Now it seemed the reflection itself was proof that I wasn't just unseen. I was being watched. The next day, I documented the window. My phone camera refused to capture anything beyond my own reflection, the man gone in each shot. The condensation remained, vague and shifting, almost mocking. I ran my finger across the glass, trying to smear the shape, and I felt a faint cold scrape against my hand, a sensation that hadn't been there before, leaving a small reddish bruise. I recoiled, heart hammering, convinced I had imagined the touch. But the bruise remained hours later, and I knew what I had felt was real. I spent the rest of the day jittery, convinced someone could be lurking outside, using my own reflection as a doorway. Each sound of the wind against the building, each drip of rain from the eaves, became a heartbeat in my ears. That evening, as I prepared a small dinner, I noticed the condensation forming again, this time more pronounced, almost perfectly aligned with my movements. When I turned to leave the kitchen, I thought I caught a shadow move past the living room, subtle and deliberate. I froze, breath shallow, every nerve on edge, but the apartment remained empty. The reflection smiled wider, somehow sharper, aware I had noticed, and I felt the prickling of eyes on the back of my neck. Mark called again, asking if I'd been drinking too much coffee, teasing me about my imagination. I didn't mention the bruise. The denial of my own experience from someone I trusted made the isolation more intense. The reflection had become my only companion, a silent observer that knew my every hesitation, every anxious tremor. That night, I tried to sleep with the curtains drawn, but the condensation crept through the gaps, faintly visible even in the dark, and I swear I could see him leaning closer, studying me. Each time I rolled over, I imagined the reflection shifting, the grin growing, aware of every beat of my heart. I would wake to find the bruise faintly throbbing, a physical reminder that what I was seeing was more than imagination. The next morning, I cautiously peered at the glass and saw the face again. Clearer, more defined, the features no longer ambiguous. My pulse raced, and I took a photo, hoping to finally prove something to myself. The image came back corrupted, the pixels distorted into jagged, abstract patterns, the smile smeared into unrecognizable chaos. I felt a metallic tang in my mouth, nausea pressing against my ribs. Over the following days, I avoided the dining room window, covering it with sheets and towels. But even then, condensation would creep beneath the fabric in the cold mornings, and the faint impression of a face pressed against the cloth. Once, I felt a brush against my arm, like a fingertip grazing skin. And when I looked, there was a faint red mark, tiny but distinct. I tried telling Mark again, describing the movements, the shape, and he again dismissed it, suggesting I was alone too long and losing my mind. That dismissal left a hollow ache in my chest, a cruel echo of my own fear, that no one could ever truly see what I saw. On Thanksgiving itself, I set the table quietly, trying to ignore the small sounds, the soft drip of rain, the hum of the heater, the subtle scrape of something against glass that wasn't there. I moved slowly, almost mechanically, and when I looked at the reflection, he was there, standing perfectly still, smiling at me. I caught my breath and turned. Empty apartment. My anxiety peaked, metallic taste in my mouth, pulse thrumming in my ears. I forced myself to leave the table for a moment, and when I returned, the condensation had shifted again, forming a near-perfect outline of a face that didn't belong to anyone I knew. I felt the faint prickling of something on my hand, and when I glanced, another tiny bruise had appeared on my wrist. Each mark, each distorted photo, each corrupted recording confirmed that this presence was real, intimate, patient, and indifferent to my terror. I avoided the window for the rest of the evening, eating minimally, sitting with my back to the glass. But I felt the gaze constantly, the awareness of a presence that mirrored my movements and anticipated my pauses. By the end of the night, I couldn't look anymore. I covered every reflective surface, mirrors, glass doors, anything that might give a reflection, and still felt the weight of being known too deeply, observed in ways that no one else could acknowledge. The marks persisted, faint but insistent, reminders of the boundary I could not cross, and the presence that would not leave. Months later, even when the condensation had faded with warmer weather, I carried the memory of the face, the smile, the impossibility of it all. Each time I moved to a new apartment, the first thing I did was cover mirrors, glass doors, any surface that might reflect an image back at me. I avoided reflective surfaces altogether, living cautiously, aware that seeing could invite something deeper, something that understood my smallest, most private fears. I survived, but I am changed, and I warn anyone who sees faces form in condensation, smiles in reflections when no one is there. Cover your mirrors. Don't look twice. Some presences are patient, and once they know you, they do not forget. I had been living in Richlands, Virginia, for years, working quietly as a postal worker, my life measured in rounds of mail and evenings spent alone in my small house at the edge of town. I'd always felt a quiet weight in the backyard, where my grandfather was buried beneath the old maple tree without a headstone. I never said goodbye, never even visited him properly after he passed, and the guilt sat heavy in my chest. That October evening, cold and crisp with the first frost forming delicate patterns on the grass, I was sitting down to dinner with my small family when I noticed the leaves of that maple trembling, though the air was still, and for a moment I thought it was just the light catching the branches wrong. Then I saw it. Someone standing beneath the tree, perfectly still, framed by the long shadows of the yard, looking straight at me. I froze, fork halfway to my mouth, telling myself it was a neighbor or one of the kids sneaking around, but there was no one else in the yard. I tried to rationalize it, shaking my head, muttering about exhaustion or frost making the branches jitter. But the figure didn't move, didn't breathe, and when I blinked, the shadows didn't change. Something in my chest tightened, that old regret flaring. I could feel it even as my sister laughed across the table at a joke I didn't hear, the normalcy around me contrasting sharply with the impossible figure in the yard. My hands were clammy, and the metallic taste of fear settled on my tongue as I sipped my water. I went outside after dinner, telling myself I'd just scare off a stray animal. But when I stepped onto the porch, the figure was closer to the maple now, unnaturally still. Leaves at its feet had shifted, forming a pattern that seemed deliberate, almost symbolic, and one caught my eye. A perfect handprint burned into its surface, crimson and unmistakable. I knelt, reaching out, but it crumbled to ash before my fingers touched it. I called for my mother to come see, and she stepped onto the porch, squinting, shaking her head. "There's nothing here," she said firmly, brushing past me. Her dismissal left me more alone than ever, the quiet weight of the tree pressing down as if it were watching me. The next night, I stayed in the living room, curtains drawn, lights low, but every creak of the house made me jump. I heard the soft shuffle of leaves outside, the faint rustle that could have been the wind, except the air was dead still again. I caught glimpses of the figure from the kitchen window, just standing there, immobile, watching, and every time I moved, it seemed to tilt its head slightly, though not fully, almost like it recognized my hesitation. I rubbed my arm absently and noticed a pale bruise forming near my wrist, a mark I couldn't remember earning, a cold, unwelcome proof that my mind was not inventing all of this. I tried to keep myself occupied, baking bread and doing small chores, but the maple never left my thoughts. I began leaving small things on the porch, food scraps, a cup of cider, almost as a test or a peace offering. One night I saw the figure again as I passed the kitchen window, closer than before, and the frost on the grass glimmered against the moonlight. The leaves quivered, and I could swear the hand-shaped burn was now etched on the snow-dusted ground, as if it had transferred from the leaf to the earth itself. My heart thumped so hard I thought my chest would give out, and I swore out loud, cursing myself for all the things I hadn't said to him. Another evening, my nephew wandered onto the porch behind me, laughing, and I pointed toward the tree. "Look," I said, voice trembling. He peered out, then shrugged, unconcerned. "It's just a tree, Auntie," he said before running back inside. That denial, innocent though it was, made the isolation sharper. I felt my breath fog the glass even in the warm kitchen, an echo of my guilt, and the weight of what I hadn't done pressed on me like the frost settling over the yard. The tree seemed to pulse with awareness, leaves trembling in ways that no wind could account for. By the following week, I had a routine. Leave a plate of food under the maple, check the yard from the window, and record any anomalies in a small notebook. The figure never left, though it sometimes faded when the porch light was on, only to return when I thought I had distracted myself with chores or dinner. One morning, I found a maple leaf on the windowsill, the same hand-shaped burn still perfect, the ash flaking slightly at the edges, a reminder that some things cannot be hidden or ignored. I tucked the leaf in the notebook and carried on, a ritual that became less about fear and more about respect, almost penance. I still live here, and each fall I leave something for him beneath that tree. A slice of bread, a cup of cider, whatever I have on hand. It doesn't feel like conversation or closure, only an acknowledgement of the debt I carry, the apology I can never say aloud. If you ever notice leaves trembling with no wind, or a perfect handprint burned into a leaf that wasn't yours, leave something for them. It doesn't fix the past, but ignoring it makes the weight unbearable. That's the one thing I've learned, and I follow it every October without fail. I worked the night shift as a security guard in Johnson City, Tennessee, patrolling empty warehouses and dark parking lots while the world slept. My life had settled into this lonely rhythm, and I'd convinced myself it was safe, predictable, even comforting, until last fall when the wind began stripping the oaks bare and the piles of leaves under the big tree in my yard started behaving strangely. I'd been exhausted from consecutive 12-hour shifts, my body ache-heavy, mind fogged, when I stepped outside to smoke and noticed the leaf pile wasn't just a pile anymore. It had shifted into a shape like a person lying face down, arms splayed. At first I laughed nervously, blaming my imagination or the way shadows played in the dim porch light. But the unease settled deep, tapping into the quiet guilt I carried from failing to protect my younger brother years ago. The next morning, the leaf pile had changed again, curled in on itself, a small figure almost fetal in shape. No wind had stirred. I could see the stillness of the air. I went to work trying to rationalize it, telling myself someone might be playing a joke, maybe kids wandering through the yard, though no footprints ever appeared in the dirt or the grass. By that evening, I started checking the kitchen window before going to bed and noticed a single red leaf clinging to the glass, stubborn against the breeze. It seemed innocuous, yet the way it held there made my chest tighten, a quiet reminder that I couldn't fully control even the small things around me. One night, after finishing a long shift, I saw the leaf pile crawling, the leaves forming something almost animate, shifting toward the edge of the yard. I rubbed my eyes, heart pounding, whispered to myself that I was tired, hallucinating. But when I stepped closer, a metallic smell of decay drifted from the leaves, and I felt a prickling sensation along my arm, as if invisible fingers had brushed my skin. I grabbed my phone to take a photo, thinking if I could show someone, they'd believe me. But when I looked at the image, the shape was distorted, the figure blurred beyond recognition, a smear of brown and red leaves that made my stomach drop. My neighbor, when I mentioned it, laughed it off and said I needed sleep, dismissing the evidence I had in my hand. The nights grew worse. I would step outside and hear subtle rustling, even when no wind moved. One evening, I heard a soft scrape, and when I turned, I thought I saw something move against the shadows at the base of the tree, just beyond the porch light's reach. My pulse jumped, and I grabbed a broom defensively, but the yard was empty, silent except for the occasional whisper of leaves shifting. The fear built in layers. My mind started questioning what was real, my sleep fraying, my hands trembling as I walked past the kitchen window and saw that same stubborn red leaf stuck to the glass, holding its place with a quiet insistence. I tried to remove it, but it clung stubbornly, defying logic. It happened again when I was inspecting the pile under the streetlight outside my home. The leaves had arranged themselves into a crawling figure, the shape moving slowly, inch by inch, toward the road. I took a step back, tripping over the edge of the porch, and landed hard, scraping my elbow. The bruise stayed for weeks, a physical reminder that something real had touched me, or that I had pushed myself too far in my fear. I called a friend over, desperate for reassurance. He came, smiled, and told me I was imagining things, that the wind and my fatigue were conspiring to frighten me. But I knew what I'd seen, and the fear nested deeper, unshakable. By the end of the week, I tried confronting it directly. I raked the leaves flat, straightened the pile, and sat on the porch, watching, cigarette in hand, muscles tense. Hours passed, and I thought the movement had ceased, but then, imperceptibly, the pile shifted. Leaves began forming limbs, curling upward like tiny, writhing bodies, inching across the grass. I stood, frozen, feeling my heartbeat echo in my ears, the cold autumn wind pressing at my neck. I realized the red leaf had returned to my kitchen window, visible from where I stood outside, almost mocking in its persistence. And I understood that I was no longer the protector of this yard, this home. I was a bystander to something I couldn't control. Sleep became a battleground. I would wake to find red leaves on my windowsill, on my porch, even inside my home, though I had no memory of bringing them in. Each leaf a quiet accusation, a reminder that the fear, the sense of being watched and manipulated, followed me no matter where I went. When I finally decided to leave Johnson City, I packed quickly, relieved yet anxious, hoping that distance would sever the connection. I moved to a new town, new home, but it didn't matter. The red leaves appeared again in the yard, stubborn, impossible, and I knew they would continue to follow, a small, persistent signal of a presence I could not escape. If you ever notice a single red leaf stuck to your window or clinging stubbornly to the ground near your home, don't ignore it. Don't assume it's nothing. I've lived with that warning now for months, carried it across state lines, and it's never been wrong. It's a quiet thing, subtle, but it will find you. You'll know. And when you see it, you'll understand the sense of being watched, the creeping awareness that some things in the world are not yours to control. I learned this the hard way, and I still see the leaves every fall. They wait, they remind, and I have nowhere left to hide. I'd been working the harvest alone for weeks, the sun dipping behind the ridges of Galax and leaving long shadows over the pumpkin fields, and I couldn't remember the last time someone had asked how I was doing beyond the casual nod of a passing farmer. My hands were stained orange from carving, the smell of pumpkin and rotting leaves clinging to my clothes, and I kept thinking maybe this season I'd finally belong somewhere, even if it was just under the indifferent sky of this abandoned farm. I had just finished loading the last of the gourds onto the trailer when I noticed one pumpkin on the edge of the patch that I didn't remember carving. It sat there, hollowed and glowing faintly from the late sun, with a key nestled inside where the seed cavity should have been. I didn't remember placing it there, and the coppery scent of decay hit me immediately, sharp and clinging, like it had seeped into my skin already. I laughed nervously and pocketed the key, thinking it a prank, but the smell seemed to follow me wherever I went, even when I returned to the small shack I'd been using as a bunkhouse. That night, I tried to shake it off in the shower, scrubbing until my arms burned, but the scent clung like a second skin, and I could swear I was hearing whispers coming from the corner of the room. Low, sibilant, too soft to make out, but unmistakably speaking. I told myself it was the wind through the loose boards, that my imagination was stretched thin from loneliness and overwork, but the key in my pocket seemed to pulse against my leg, a metallic heartbeat that made my skin prickle and my stomach twist. It was then I remembered the old shed at the far edge of the field, the one I'd avoided because of the stories of the previous owners leaving in a hurry, and a part of me knew that key belonged there. The next morning, I found myself standing in front of the shed, the pumpkin smell growing stronger with each step. I slid the key into the lock, expecting resistance or decay, but it turned easily, and the door creaked open, revealing darkness so complete I could barely see the floor. As I stepped inside, I felt the temperature drop, my breath fogging in the cool air, and the whispers came, circling my head, gentle but insistent. I swore I heard my name, twisted and elongated, carried on the dry, musty wind of the shed. When I stepped back outside, the key felt warm again, as if satisfied, but the smell of rotten pumpkin clung even tighter, and for the first time, I felt truly seen and completely alone at the same time. I tried telling one of the other farmhands about it, laughing off the fear in my voice, but he shook his head and walked away, muttering about ghosts and nonsense, leaving me with a hollow ache that pressed on my chest. Over the next week, I noticed the whispers following me through the fields, sometimes when the wind was still, other times as I worked the pumpkins in the fading light. I would find objects slightly moved, tiny marks on my arms, scratches that I couldn't explain, and the key would feel like it was vibrating in my pocket. Once, I swore I saw a figure at the edge of the field, a shadow among the stalks, watching me with small, invisible eyes, and when I called out, the figure dissolved into the mist like it had never existed. I tried burning the pumpkin that had first held the key, but the scent only returned stronger, sticking to my clothes, my hair, even the sheets I slept on. I started keeping a notebook, scribbling down the whispers as best I could, but the words jumbled themselves in ways I couldn't control, letters morphing, lines rearranging themselves overnight as if mocking my attempts to understand. One evening, I dared to bring the key back to the shed after dark. I could feel the air tighten around me as I approached, the fog rolling in from the field, curling around my boots and thighs. I inserted the key, and the whispers started immediately, insistent, urgent, circling my head like a swarm I couldn't swat away. I backed out of the shed and fell to my knees, gagging on the smell, my hands trembling so violently I scraped a shallow cut along my forearm. I looked down and saw the bruise forming there, angry and purple, proof that what was happening wasn't just in my mind. I called for someone, anyone, but the nearest farmhouse was dark, the windows blind, and when I finally managed to shout to a passing neighbor, he blinked and shook his head, insisting he saw nothing, that I must be tired and imagining things. The isolation pressed down harder than ever, and the whispers followed me to the edge of the road, lingering as I walked, unseen but insistent. I stopped trying to explain it after that. The key became my burden, my talisman, the thing I carried everywhere, and the smell never left me, growing stronger with every shower, every attempt to wash it away. I began sleeping with it under my pillow, listening to the faint susurrus of voices drifting through my dreams, promising secrets, or just reminding me that I was alone. Sometimes, when I left it on the table or tried to throw it away, I would hear the soft, metallic click of it landing back in my pocket, the whispers curling around me again until I could no longer ignore them. I avoided other workers, stopped asking for company, because I knew the moment they noticed the key or smelled the decay, they'd step back and pretend they hadn't. It was easier this way, easier to carry the burden alone than to risk rejection again. Now, years later, I still keep the key hidden in a small wooden box beneath the floorboards. The smell clings faintly to my fingers even after I wash them obsessively. And sometimes, when the wind moves just right through the trees outside my apartment, I swear I hear it again. The low, curling whispers calling my name, soft and certain. I know I could throw the key into a river, bury it, leave it behind, but I can't. I am too afraid that the moment it is gone, the whispers will return, louder and angrier, reminding me that I was never meant to be invisible, but I will always be alone if I try to belong somewhere else. If you ever find a small, old key in a pumpkin, do not pick it up. Do not bring it inside. The smell follows, and the voices, quiet at first, will wait for you, patient and certain, until you finally understand what it is like to be seen, and yet utterly alone. I worked the night shift at the gas station on the edge of Norton, Virginia, the one where the lights never quite reached the gravel lot, and the wind swept across the mountains like it wanted to push me off the road. Nights were long, quiet, except for the occasional truck or the rustle of leaves skittering across the asphalt, and I liked it that way, even though loneliness pressed down hard. I was fighting hopelessness then, nursing a gnawing guilt from years earlier when I'd seen someone in need and turned away. It was just after 3 a.m, October chill rolling down from the ridges, when I noticed the first fleeting shadow in the rail yard across the road. A pale kid, standing still, staring straight at me through the grimy window of the old rail cart. At first I thought it was a trick of the light or fatigue, but the kid lifted a hand in a slow wave, and I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. The next night, and the night after, it was the same. 3:11 a.m. sharp, the kid at the same window, silent except for the breath fogging the glass in a warm circle, a small halo that shouldn't have appeared in the damp air. I started timing my breaks, keeping the coffee hot, telling myself I was imagining it. Sometimes I thought I glimpsed movement in the shadows behind the rail cart, a flicker of something too deliberate to be coincidental. But every time I called to the lot or ran outside, nothing was there. The fogged breath would vanish, and the kid would be gone, leaving me with a metallic taste in my mouth, a cold pressure in my chest, and the creeping suspicion that whatever I was seeing wasn't bound by ordinary rules. One night, emboldened, or maybe just desperate for confirmation, I ran across the road as the clock ticked closer to 3:11. The air bit my cheeks, the wet leaves slick beneath my boots, and I could see the rail cart clearly now, the paint peeling, the windows streaked with years of grime and rain. The kid was there, and when I stopped dead, the hand raised again, slower this time, almost pleading. I called out, my voice catching somewhere between fear and guilt. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Nothing. The kid didn't move except for that slow wave, and when I blinked, it was gone. I rushed back to the station, heart hammering, and found a shallow bruise forming along my forearm, purple against pale skin, as though something had touched me when I was running. I showed it to my manager the next day, hoping for some acknowledgement, but he just shrugged and said, "You've been staring at screens too long, Amber. Probably tired eyes." I swallowed my anger and confusion, telling myself it was easier to bear the isolation alone than to argue. Over the following weeks, the encounters grew intimate in ways I couldn't ignore. Once, while restocking shelves, I caught movement in the reflection of the sliding cooler doors. The kid's face, pale and blank, pressed against the glass behind me, breath fogging it, and I spun around, but the lot was empty. Another time, as I stepped outside to sweep the front, I felt the brush of something across my neck, a cold, fleeting touch. And when I looked, the railcart sat empty, no footprints, nothing but the swaying remnants of autumn leaves. I started keeping a small notebook, sketching the kid's pale face and the faint patterns of the fogged window. But every morning the sketches were smeared, the outlines crooked in ways I couldn't explain, as if the images themselves were resisting capture. My nights became taut with anticipation, every tick of the clock a promise that 3:11 was approaching, and I felt my own reflection fracturing in the dim light of the station. I confided in my co-worker, Jessica, one particularly raw morning, showing her the notebook, the sketches blurred and indecipherable. "It's just stress," she said, her voice tight with the need to believe normalcy, and I realized she wouldn't see it, couldn't see it, and that my fear was mine alone. That night, the wave came again, and I followed it closer than ever, circling the rail cart, calling the kid's name. The fog of breath thickened against the glass, and I swear I heard a soft whisper, a question folded into the wind. "Why didn't you help?" The words clawed at me in the pitch black, and I stumbled backward, gasping, tripping over roots and wet leaves, and when I finally looked up, the kid was gone, leaving only the faint mist of breath hovering in the air, as if it had never existed. I went home shaking, my arm still showing the mark from earlier, the physical proof that something real had brushed against me. I tried to keep my life normal after that. Days blurred into work, rest, and the monotony of a small apartment, but every fall, the memory sharpened. Around 3:11 a.m., I wake, heart hammering, the metallic taste back, and I glance toward the window, expecting, hoping, dreading to see the pale figure staring through. The apartment is empty, silent, yet I feel it. That weight of eyes, the soft insistence of guilt carried across time and space. I keep the notebook tucked in a drawer, pages smudged and corrupted, the sketches unreadable, but I know the pattern will return, that no amount of sleep or light or rational thought can undo it. I have learned to live with the constant hum of that expectation, the cyclical dread of the hour that never changes, and I warn anyone who works alone on those late, quiet nights. When you see a child's pale face through glass, breathing out fog in the darkness, do not look away too quickly. Do not assume it's nothing. Because when the clock ticks 3:11, they will be watching, and you'll remember every time you turned your back when someone needed you most. I'd been working the closing shift at a diner in Boone, North Carolina, for years, living in a tiny apartment perched above the highway where the mountains swallowed the fog whole. My life had narrowed into a careful routine of long nights, burnt coffee, and the quiet hum of loneliness since my sister disappeared 3 years ago. I still remember the last argument we had, the words I wish I could take back, the weight of guilt pressing on my chest whenever I thought of her. That night, rain was tapping on the windshield like fingernails, and I was driving the winding mountain pass home when my old FM radio crackled and suddenly switched stations on its own. Then I heard it, my sister's voice, faint and wavering, whispering my name, a sound that made my stomach twist and my hands tighten on the wheel. At first, I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, grief and exhaustion warping reality, but the static didn't stop. Each time I neared the overlook where she was last seen, the fuzz on the radio would spike, her voice pressing through just beyond comprehension. I slowed, squinting into the rain, headlights cutting through fog, and the whisper felt close enough to touch. I parked once, shaking, muttering that it had to be a coincidence, that I'd driven this road hundreds of times, that grief could play cruel tricks. But when I reached for the dial, the radio snapped to silence, leaving only a low hiss, a reminder of how close she had felt. The next night, I tried recording the radio on my phone while driving the same route. Hours later, when I played it back, the recording was filled with static, but beneath it, unmistakably, was her voice. "Please," she said, though I knew she couldn't have spoken to me from anywhere in this world. I took the recording to my brother, desperate for reassurance that I wasn't losing my mind, and he laughed, said it was probably interference, or that I was imagining things, and left the room shaking his head. That dismissal left me hollow, certain that no one could understand, and the isolation settled over me like a wet coat, cold and heavy. Driving became a terror I could not avoid. The rain seemed to have a rhythm that matched her voice, tapping on the roof of the car in uneven patterns that made me flinch. One night, headlights caught something in the fog, a figure standing near the edge of the overlook, blurred and indistinct, the way memory warps details. I froze, breath fogging the inside of my windshield, and when I blinked, it was gone, leaving only the hiss of static and the echo of her voice fading into nothing. My knuckles ached from gripping the wheel, and a bruise bloomed along my forearm from where I had dug my nails in. That mark stayed for days, a cruel proof that I had not imagined the terror entirely. I started timing my drives, avoiding her last-seen spot for a while, but the radio betrayed me each time. It would flicker, crackle, and her voice would pierce the static, calling my name with that soft urgency I remembered from childhood. I tried talking to myself, reasoning it was my guilt calling out, that I was chasing memory, but my voice caught in my throat when the sound seemed to come from outside the car as well, mingling with the hiss of rain on metal. One night, I swerved to avoid what I thought was a deer, only to find the road empty, the radio spiking into a high-pitched scream of static, and I realized the voice had no pattern, no logic, only pull and weight that I could not resist. I returned to the overlook once with a flashlight, a notebook, hoping to write down what I saw, something tangible, but the fog was thick, and when I tried to scribble notes, the pen skipped across the paper as if caught in static itself. By the time I looked up, I thought I saw a shadow near the guardrail, something small, pale, watching. I shouted, my voice trembling, but the fog swallowed the sound. The notebook remained, but pages were smudged and warped, the writing corrupted in ways I could not explain. I kept it anyway, a record of impossibility that reminded me, always, that she was still out there, or that the road itself held her presence. Sometimes, the radio would whisper her words while I was at home, late at night, when the apartment was empty. I'd jump at every static spike, feel the cold crawl of the mountain air even through closed windows. I tried leaving the city, moving to a new town, but I found myself driving the old passes again, drawn toward the mist, toward the overlook, toward the static that carried her voice. My friends asked why I kept returning to that road, and I lied, saying it was habit. But the truth is I'm chasing her, chasing some fragment of her I can still hear, and I fear I always will. If you ever hear a voice through the static of a radio, one that calls your name in a whisper that chills your chest, don't try to follow it. Don't think you can reason with it or outrun it, because I have, and it only grows stronger, more insistent with every mile. I still drive that road, every fall, drawn by the sound, hoping for something, anything, and each time I hear it, I remember that some calls cannot be answered, yet you feel compelled to respond. The road waits, the rain waits, and the static never forgets. I hadn't been back to Elizabethton in nearly a decade, not since I burned too many bridges and left the family farm behind, and the crisp fall air hitting my face the moment I stepped onto the porch felt like a slap, reminding me of all the doors I'd closed. Orange leaves had piled along the boards, curling under the wind, and the rocking chair near the edge of the porch had a presence I couldn't shake, even when it was empty. I lit a cigarette, the smoke curling into the evening like it belonged in some old photograph. And for a while, I just let the wind carry away the ache of shame and regret I'd carried across the years. Then I noticed the chair moving, slow, tentative rocks back and forth. And I swore no one else was outside with me. My heart clenched because part of me wanted to believe it was a trick of the wind. But deep down, I knew it felt deliberate, like a message I wasn't ready to read. Inside, the smell of cooking and apples simmering on the stove reminded me of holidays I'd missed, and I leaned back against the doorframe, trying to convince myself that maybe one of my cousins or uncles had snuck out for a smoke and just hadn't spoken. But every time I glanced toward the chair, it had a small, empty beer bottle beside it, one I hadn't seen moments before. I picked it up and carried it back inside, setting it on the counter, and by the time I returned to the porch, it had reappeared beside the chair, the condensation still clinging to it like it had just been set down. I asked Aunt Clara if anyone had gone outside, and she laughed nervously, shaking her head, saying she hadn't seen a soul out there. That same disbelief in her eyes felt like another layer of isolation pressing down on me. Later that night, I stepped outside again to clear my head and found the chair rocking more vigorously, as if impatient. I sat in the other chair, trying to smoke faster than the fear crawling up my spine, and the empty beer bottle was back where it started. I tapped it with my foot, wondering if maybe it had rolled there on its own, but it didn't move. I leaned closer and noticed the faint outline of a handprint, wet and barely there, on the armrest facing me. My stomach dropped, the metallic tang of fear in my mouth, and I ran my fingers over it, leaving my own imprint behind. When I went back inside to show my cousin, he frowned, confused, and when he looked at the porch through the window a moment later, he shrugged, saying the chair had never moved. I felt my chest tighten, because it wasn't just the chair. It was everything I thought I could control, slipping through my fingers again, just like it had when I walked away from this family all those years ago. The next evening, I tried ignoring the porch, staying with family and keeping my hands busy at the dinner table. But I couldn't shake the sound of the chair's rhythm through the wall, a subtle scrape against the boards. I stepped outside again, flashlight in, hand, and the chair rocked in wide, deliberate swings. The beer bottle glistened under the porch light, and when I reached for it, the chair stopped rocking as if it had been waiting for me to act. My hands shook as I carried the bottle inside, placing it atop the fridge, only to find it returned moments later when I checked the porch again. A small bruise had formed on my right forearm, dull and dark, as if I had bumped into something hard, but nothing had been there. I told myself it was nerves, stress, years of self-doubt catching up, but my chest tightened every time I turned my gaze toward that porch. By the third night, I felt trapped in the rhythm of its rocking. I smoked outside until my fingers went numb, staring at the empty chair and trying to measure the distance between reality and my mind, my throat dry with the tension. Then it shifted slightly, not in a smooth rock, but in a motion that suggested someone had just lifted themselves and sat back down. I called out, asking if anyone was out there, and the only response was the whisper of the wind through the leaves, carrying the faintest creak of the porch floor, as if the chair itself was sighing. Inside, everyone swore they hadn't gone out, and when I insisted, their eyes glazed in that polite disbelief that made me feel small and unwelcome. I touched the bruise again, rubbing the warmth back into my arm, but the impression remained stubborn, proof that something had been there. By the time I went to bed that night, the sense of being watched hadn't left. I had the beer bottle in the kitchen, the porch door locked, and yet I couldn't stop thinking about the rocking chair. When I stepped out briefly the next morning to gather the newspaper, there it was, rocking gently in the early light, the bottle perched neatly beside it like it had always been there. I froze, cigarette halfway to my lips, and the metallic taste of anxiety lingered, sharp and invasive. I backed into the house, heart hammering, telling myself I had to leave, had to reclaim the space I had once lost. My family didn't understand, or maybe they just refused to, and that left me with the eerie solitude of the porch and the quiet whisper of the chair. I left later that afternoon, the crisp fall leaves crunching beneath my boots, the air cold enough to make my lungs ache. The rocking chair was still moving, the empty beer bottle glinting in the sun, untouched yet undeniably present. I didn't look back until I was halfway down the road, and even then, the image stayed with me, the weight of it pressing against the memory of all the times I had thought I could start over and failed. If you ever visit a family gathering and notice the rocking chair moving by itself, don't stay out on the porch too long. Don't touch the bottle. Just go inside, close the door, and leave before the night remembers you. I left the bar just after midnight, the parking lot empty except for a stray cat darting under the flickering streetlight. And for the first time in weeks, I felt the fragile quiet that came after leaving him behind. The roads out of Harlan are narrow, winding like veins through the mountains, and the fog had settled low, thick and cold, brushing against my cheeks as I rolled the window down to breathe. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight, knuckles whitening, and I kept telling myself it was just the leftover tension from months of looking over my shoulder. But then I saw it. A truck, only one headlight blazing faintly behind me, moving in sync with my car as if it were waiting for me to panic. I blinked, trying to shake off the fatigue, but the single light flickered like a heartbeat, and suddenly I wasn't alone on the road anymore. I tried slowing down, letting it pass, but as I rounded the next blind curve, it was there again, the headlight quivering in the fog. My radio cut out with a loud static crack, and I could swear I heard a whisper through the interference, just low enough to make my stomach knot. I told myself it had to be my imagination. Too much coffee, too little sleep, the stress of the breakup. But the way the light hovered, neither closing in nor letting me go, pressed the truth into my chest. Something was wrong. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying to focus on the painted lines beneath my tires, the fog smelling damp and metallic, and tried to tell myself I could drive past it, but the road only twisted deeper into the hollow, giving no escape. At the next turn, I slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering, and parked on the shoulder, hoping the truck would simply move past me. My breath came in sharp, uneven bursts as I scanned the fog, and for a moment it seemed gone. But then it appeared on the next bend, perfectly aligned, its one headlight flickering again like a pulse. I dared a glance at the rearview mirror, and the reflection made my stomach lurch. The windshield was misted over from the cold. But through it, I could just make out a shape, shadowed and still, sitting in the driver's seat as if waiting for me to move. My hands shook, my chest tight, and I grabbed my phone, dialing 911, but the call wouldn't go through. The signal gone, leaving me suspended in a bubble of isolation and fear. I tried reasoning, telling myself it had to be someone else, someone local playing a cruel joke. But as I drove, the same moments kept repeating. The truck appearing on every blind curve, the headlight flickering like a heartbeat, and the fog pressing close to the glass. I glimpsed its rusted body in the peripheral, water dripping off the fender, and for some reason that steady, rhythmic drip reminded me of a clock counting down the seconds until something inevitable would happen. I started recording video on my phone, shaking hands, barely able to hold the device steady. But when I played it back in the tiny light of my dashboard, the truck was gone from every clip, leaving only fog and trees, the headlights absent as if it had never been there at all. Every time I slowed or tried to turn off the road, it would vanish, only to reappear, the same distance behind me, as if mocking my exhaustion. The metallic taste of fear lingered in my mouth, and my hands ached, knuckles bruised from gripping the wheel so tightly. I remembered a story from a fellow server about a ghostly truck that haunted the roads around the hollow, and a chill ran down my spine. I had dismissed it before, But now the idea felt painfully real, like the stories had been waiting for me to leave my old life behind. I kept glancing at the road ahead, listening to the tires hum over wet asphalt, and each flicker of that single headlight made me jump, my pulse hammering against my ribs. The final bend before my driveway felt like an eternity, the fog thickening until the headlights behind me were only a pale, trembling glow, and I thought maybe, just maybe, I had finally outrun it. I parked at home, doors locked, shaking, feeling a bruise forming along my shoulder where I had pressed too hard against the seatbelt, the metallic taste of fear still heavy in my mouth. I stepped out of the car, trying to convince myself it was over, the cool night air wrapping around me like a thin, protective sheet. But then, deep in the woods across the yard, I saw the faint flicker again, the same heartbeat pulse through the mist, and a cold weight settled in my chest that told me it had never left the hollow, never truly stopped following. I haven't driven that road alone since, and even now, months later, I avoid leaving my house after dark. Sometimes, when I glance out the window, I catch a flicker in the distance, and I feel that same tightening in my chest, the knowledge that the hollow has a rhythm, and that one headlight flickering is a warning I cannot ignore. If you're ever driving through Harlan, or any road winding deep into the mountains and see a single headlight trembling behind you, do not try to pass it or pull over. Just keep driving, keep your eyes forward, and don't stop until you're somewhere with lights, because the last thing you want is to let it catch you on the turns. Which story setting scared you the most? Let me know in the comments. And that wraps up our 10 Appalachian horror stories. Which one left you looking over your shoulder? If you made it all the way, type, "The mountains are watching" in the comments so I know you're one of the brave ones. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and remember, the hills always have eyes.